let's talk about cluster, especially sustainable development of clusters. You can estimate there are around 6,000–7,000 cluster initiatives all over the world, but not all of them are sustainable. That's the reason why today we talk about success factors for sustainable cluster development. So the question is, are there common patterns that you can decide, contribute, whether or not a cluster you are going to develop is sustainable or not? And we can discuss this topic according to the life cycle of clusters, which can be summarized like in the beginning, you initiate, you develop an embryonic cluster, then you establish everything which is needed for governance and memberships, then it is operationalized, and after a couple of years, it has to go into transformation because technology and markets are always changing. So these four key elements of a cluster life cycle can be considered, and for each of these life cycles, there are some pattern for successful cluster development. So let's start with success factors for the initiation, that means for the establishment phase. And here we can see certain four patterns which are very typical for any kind of cluster development in the world. First of all, we have to measure what is the potential. Very often we can see cluster development without any potential because the critical mass is missing, the products or the companies are not competitive. So potential measurement is very important. After that, we have to see, because clusters is all about companies, research institutions, and technology providers and training providers. So we have to see what actor we have to involve. Then, in the end, cluster matters. That means they have to provide added value. And at the beginning, we have to identify what could be the potential added value companies, research institutions can benefit from the cluster development. And then, in the end of the initiation phase, we need the strategy. Here you can see separate steps. I will not go into detail. That is mentioned in our training curricula and compendium. But these are the typical patterns which are very important for successful cluster development or cluster initiation. So, after the initiation phase, we are moving to, when it comes to cluster development and sustainable cluster development, to establishment phase. That means what has to be done to really establish a cluster which is sustainable. Also, we can see here four similar patterns you can apply all over the world. First of all is we have a strategy, but we have to know how to operationalize. That means we have to turn the strategy paper into an action plan and also a financial plan. Financial is a key issue. And we can see here it varies all over the world. Let's take the red one here, the public funding. In Africa, we can see there's a high share of public funding. In Europe, it's a bit lower. In Latin America, it's even less. And in Asia, it's something in the middle. So we can see here financing really matters. So if once the strategy is operationalized, we have to find the right legal form. It's not always an association. It can be something different, and it depends very much on the strategy of the cluster initiative. Then we need the governance, and in the end, the staffing, the cluster management. So that is important for the development. After these preparatory activities, we have to see, does the cluster can really deliver? That means what kind of services, what kind of activities a cluster can offer to their members. That is one of the key activities. And since we put a lot of efforts here in terms of money, in terms of in-kind, in the end it's also important that we can monitor the progress, that we can communicate the added value and the impact our cluster might create. So these four patterns are very relevant if you are ready to establish a cluster. Over time, when the cluster is established, when we have all the structures, when we have the services implemented, the cluster management, we talk about the operationalization of a cluster initiative. So that means this is a very long period. These both periods are very short normally, and here we have an operationalization phase. Oh, the question is, what are the success factors here? And we can see that the cluster management is slowly moving towards a process and a project management, to keep all the balls, all the different services in the air, to communicate with all the cluster members and actors. So you have to have some process management competences available. Clusters have to grow. You normally start with a smaller number of companies, 20, 30 companies, but we need critical mass. That means here we have to find new cluster managers, very important cluster management and companies. So not always the number matters, also the quality. And this cluster management has to establish close ties to these companies. And in the end, after a longer period, we have to focus on professionalization. Clusters are professional service providers in the field of innovation and competitiveness. We need benchmarks to see how cluster can compare themselves. We need to extend our services, and also in the end, internationalization, going to other markets, really matters. As I mentioned, this normally is a quite long time and period. So in the end, when a cluster is operating 10 years, 15 years, industries change, technology changes, market change. So a cluster, if it wants to be sustainable and successful, have to be able to transform. Let's take the automotive sector. The automotive sector is transforming to mobility. So basically, people are not that much interested how to go from place A to B, so they want to have a good mobility, as an example. So, and also here we can see pattern how to help clusters to transform. Strategic foresight, so not just day-to-day management, rather than to identify what are the upcoming challenges, how a cluster can really reply and respond to these initiatives and these issues. So that is something which is very important if a cluster want to transform. Cross-clustering, that means cooperating with actors outside of the traditional sector from other areas. That becomes very important as well if a cluster wants to transform. And in the end, that's one of the current trends, is a cluster should be embedded into a regional strategy for innovation and competitiveness in order to help also the region, the entire region, to transform, not only cluster itself. So this was a short introduction that we can see according to the different stage of cluster development that we have similar pattern. More information you can see from our training course material. Thank you.